Hello. Before beginning Lorca's Blood Wedding today, I want to start with a brief overview of a theory of tragedy that was immensely influential for dramatists in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Birth of Tragedy, published in 1873, was the first major work by the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. As the excerpts from this groundbreaking study that I sent you indicate, Nietzsche believed that Greek tragedy arose from the coupling of two different artistic temperaments in classical Greece, which he named after the two gods, referring to them as the Apollonian and the Dionysian. Now, we know that the ancient tragedies we have studied were part of the city of Dionysia, festival each year in Athens, that the god Dionysius, the god of music and wine and art, was the presiding deity at the founding of this event, and that the plays were part of a seasonal devotion to Dionysius, and that the original tragedies were sung by a chorus before individual characters ever began to appear on stage, first in the works of Aeschylus. But this shift from Dionysian choral music and dancing to plays that had plots and characters came about, Nietzsche argues, only through the addition of another artistic sensibility, which Nietzsche and the ancient Greeks associated with Apollo, whereas Dionysius is the god of music and a kind of collective choral expression. Apollo is the god of sculpture, which usually depicts individual human forms, like the individual characters that began to appear on the Greek stage. Now, Greek tragedy as we know it in the works of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides was the product then of a fusion of these dialectically opposed forms of art, according to Nietzsche. He writes that there existed a tremendous opposition in origin and aims between the Apollonian art of sculpture and the Dionysian art of music. Eventually, by a metaphysical miracle of the Hellenistic will, they appear coupled with each other, and through this coupling ultimately generate an equally Dionysian and Apollonian form of art, Greek tragedy, as we know it. Now, the Apollonian artistic sensibility that gave rise to characters is rational, controlled, idealistic, and it expresses, above all things, what Nietzsche calls the individual principle. It is embodied, this aesthetic, in highly individualized subjective characters like Medea, and it is expressed through the psychological depth of their speeches. Of the Apollonian, Nietzsche writes, Apollo is the god of all plastic energies, the shining one, the weight, the deity of light. We must keep in mind that measured restraint, freedom from wilder emotions, that calm of the sculptor god Apollo is what he represents. We might call Apollo the glorious divine image of the individual principle. Now, by contrast, the Dionysian urge to artistic expression that originally went into Greek tragedy as a form of music and dance, that Dionysian artistic element was passionate and instinctive and collective, which is why it was embodied and expressed by the chorus, expressing themselves as a single voice, as a single character, who seemed in their chants and songs and dances seized by a kind of passionate delirium that Nietzsche associates with the Dionysian sensibility. He writes, as Dionysian artistic emotions awoke and glow in intensity, everything subjective, everything individual vanishes into complete self-forgetfulness. Singing and dancing crowds, ever increasing in number, whirled themselves from place to place under this collective Dionysian impulse. Now, with a sense of universal harmony, each individual feels himself united, reconciled, and fused with his neighbor, as if fused with a mysterious primordial unity in paroxysms of enchanted ecstasy, paroxysms of intoxication. Now, Greek tragedy, then, Nietzsche argues, as we know it, is a synthesis of these antithetical approaches to art. But Nietzsche regards the Dionysian not only as the originary inspiration behind Greek drama, but also he sees it as, in a sense, the subject of all Greek dramas until Euripides. Even when individual characters appeared, the real underlying story, Nietzsche claims, was the myth of Dionysius, who dies and is revived in his central myth. The central religious mystery at the Dionysian festival and the central meaning of the tragic dramas before Euripides, Nietzsche says, was essentially the myth of Dionysius's death. Agamemnon and Clytemnestra and their deaths were merely, quote, masks of Dionysius, which was the real underlying story. In the earliest times, Greek drama, when there was only the chorus, and the only stage the hero the chorus described was Dionysius himself. The sole theme of Greek tragedy, then, was the suffering of Dionysius, who was experiencing the agonies of individuation by which, according to myth, he was torn to pieces. Until Euripides and the development of individualized character, all the celebrated figures on the Greek stage, Prometheus, Oedipus, etc., were but masks of the suffering Dionysius, versions, essentially, of Dionysius' suffering and death. Now, you'll note that Nietzsche seems to prefer Dionysian art, the art of choral frenzy and collective song and dance, to the Apollonian art of individualized characters who enact their own tragedies. And Nietzsche blames Euripides, the youngest of the three great Greek tragedians, for this decline of the element of the Dionysian and the overemphasis of the Apollonian in Greek tragedy. What did you want, sacrilegious Euripides, he writes, when you sought to compel this dying myth to serve you? That is, the myth of the death of Dionysius. It died under your violent hands, Euripides. The genius of Dionysian music died with you too. Through your greedy hands you plundered all the gardens of music. You have abandoned Dionysius. Your heroes have only copied masked passions and speak only copied masked speeches, but they've lost touch with the underlying myth. Well, note that, ironically, the tragedy in which Dionysius actually appears as a character is in Euripides' The Bacchants. But by turning the god into a character who, by the way, destroys King Pentheus but is not destroyed or torn to pieces himself, Nietzsche suggests that there is a kind of devaluation of the true Dionysian myth and spirit. In this characterization, Euripides destroys the real genius of Dionysius, whose story was originally celebrated and sung and danced by choruses who seemed inspired and intoxicated long before the myth was ever enacted, indirectly, he suggests, by characters. Now, two aspects of Nietzsche's tragic theory appealed to playwrights in the decades that followed him, this being written in the early 1870s. First was Nietzsche's valoration of those parts of human nature that are non-rational, instinctive, and passionate, that he calls Dionysian. His suggestion that these eruptive elements are transpersonal and universal, and that they're more powerful than the civilized, rational parts of our personality, those that we can control, Apollonian, appealed to Strindberg and Ibsen and others. We see this idea of the Dionysian power, for example, in Strindberg's exploration of the captain's submerged desire for merging with the mother, for eliminating his own individuation as a man. And we find an echo of Nietzsche also, I think, in Ibsen's portrait of Lovborg, his creative figure, you'll recall Lovborg, whose visionary power of expression is yoked to his alcoholism, both of which are domains of Dionysius. You'll recall Hedda's fantasy of Lovborg returning with vine leaves in his hair, which evoke both those aspects, the creative and the drunken. A second reason why Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy appealed to modern tragedians is that it takes a mythic rather than individual approach to characterization. We saw that idea in Synge's Riders to the Sea, and we'll find it even more pronounced in Lorca's Blood Wedding. It's the idea that the tragic characters we see are destined to enact ancient patterns rather than merely pursuing their own individual destinies. What might seem to be, at first, personal tragedies ultimately reduce to a single tragedy that is repeated again and again through time, just as Nietzsche argued that all Greek dramas before Euripides really reduced to versions of the violent death of Dionysius. Okay, now let's turn to Lorca and Blood Wedding. Federico Garcia Lorca was a great Spanish playwright who wrote his greatest play, Blood Wedding, and had it produced in Madrid in 1933. Blood Wedding is unlike any tragedy we have read, and really different from any work by any modern dramatist that I know of. Unlike Hamlet, Othello, Phaedra, Hedda Gabler, Wojciech the Father, unlike all those plays, Lorca's tragedy is not primarily interested in human psychology. The characters, especially the bride and Leonardo, are moved by drives so strong that they don't devote much time to reflecting on them, nor does Lorca reflect very much psychologically on those drives. But as in Phaedra, it is true that the central drive is sexual and that it is forbidden. Now, Blood Wedding is then not just the deadly feud between two families, but it is also a play in which the sexual drive is complicated by the repressive power of the Catholic Church and by social traditions. Unlike Phaedra and Hippolytus, Lorca's lovers don't spend time analyzing their overpowering attraction to one another. Instead, they simply act on it and suffer the tragic consequences. Now, the generic names of most of the characters, the mother, the bride, the bridegroom, etc., indicate that Lorca isn't interested in individual psychology, but rather interested in certain universal drives and impulses and archetypal behavioral patterns. And the names indicate that the events derive from these universal, paradigmatic drives. Now, there are, I think, three overlapping ways to approach Blood Wedding, and that critics have in the past, and I want to draw on all of them in analyzing the play. The first is that one might view the play as a folk tragedy. These are peasants, not unlike those that we find on the Aran Islands in Sing, and their story grows out of the folk tradition of their setting. That setting is the cultural soil of an isolated part of Andalusia in southern Spain. Okay? In Lorca's time, and even today, ancient customs and local rituals hold sway in this part of Andalusia. Primitive superstitions vie, certainly in Lorca's time, with Catholic worship. Bloody family feuds persist for generations, and flamenco, the dance that originated in Andalusia, expresses the passionate yearning and violence and despair of the people who live there. There is a strong sense of destiny, of fate, built into the folk beliefs of this region, as there was in the Aran Islands. Lorca grew up himself in rural Andalusia, and so he developed a keen sense of fatality that made life there, for him, intrinsically suited to tragedy, which always involves insuperable forces beyond one's control. A second approach to the play that I'll be drawing upon invites us to read it through the framework of myth. But unlike the Greek tragedies that we've read, and unlike Racine's Phaedra, which are set in the distant past, Lorca adopts elements of ancient myth and applies them or imports them to the world of the present. And in doing this, of course, he's like certain other modernist writers, T.S. Eliot and James Joyce among them, who see these fundamental mythic patterns still viable and being played out, though we may not recognize them in the contemporary world. Now, although the setting of Blood Wedding is then the 20th century, the fact is still that the way of life in the play and the events that we find unfolding seem timeless. They seem outside history, even though they occur in the early 20th century. At the heart of the tragedy is a family feud between the bridegroom's family and the Felixes, Leonardo's clan, which the bridegroom's mother despises because the Felixes killed her husband and later her elder son in knife fights. This feud and the story of forbidden desire are, on Lorca's part, deliberate nods to ancient Greek myth, And Lorca's use, for example, of the woodcutters in Act 3 as a kind of chorus makes us aware that he's adopting some of the conventions of Greek tragedy and blending that tradition with the distinctive customs and folk idiom of southern Spain. The third and final approach we'll be considering is to consider Bloodwedding as a symbolist drama. That is, as a tragedy whose meaning is communicated less by dialogue and language than by potent symbols that are introduced, represented visually, and that acquire complex meanings as the play develops. Among these symbols that we'll be exploring are knives, blood, grapes, soil, flowers, horses, water, and the moon. These elemental symbols reflect the agrarian culture of Andalusia, but they also have universal resonances. And Lorca evokes sort of constellations of these symbols in a language of lyrical intensity. And the language sings throughout the play precisely because it is filled with these primal images. Now, Lorca was, however, not just a playwright. He was also a great poet, and so not surprisingly, within Bloodwedding, he shifts and moves back and forth from prose to incantatory poetry, verse, in a style that again recalls the choral chants that we find in Sophocles in ancient Greece. Now, we'll see this introduction of verse into the play beginning in Act 1, Scene 2, but we'll see that it becomes the dominant expressive form in Act 3. Before turning to the beginning of Bloodwedding, a few words about Lorca's all too short life. As a university student in the Andalusian city of Granada, he began writing poetry and plays, including plays for puppets, while he was also becoming interested in music and art. Those interests, particularly interest in visual arts, led to a friendship with the surrealist painter Salvador Dalí that later died out. Up until Bloodwedding, which Lorca began when he was 35, he was better known as a poet, including a famous verse lament for a bullfighter friend who died of his wounds in the bull ring. A year later, Lorca wrote his other tragic masterpiece, The House of Bernardo Alba, about a family of sex-starved sisters living, again, in rural Andalusian isolation. Now, at this time in Spain, in the mid-1930s, when these plays were being written, there was an increasing political strife. Lorca sympathized with the socialists and supported the left-wing Popular Front, and that proved to be his undoing. Even though he wasn't involved in any radical political activity, and even though he made it clear that he didn't want to be, he was nonetheless labeled. Not long after the Popular Front won a general election, the fascist General Franco, who would soon become dictator, launched a military coup against the elected government in Madrid. This frenzy of repressive right-wing zeal spread to Granada in Andalusia, where Lorca was living at the time. And although Lorca tried to take refuge, he was arrested by Franco's fascist thugs without any evidence of his own subversive political activity. Lorca was taken outside town, and with a few other socialist sympathizers, he was shot in an olive grove in 1936. The Franco regime later tried to claim that Lorca died of war wounds. Now, I mention this because Bloodwedding is many things, but one thing it is not is a political tragedy. I find no political subtext in it whatsoever. Lorca tried to keep his political sympathies out of his work. But poets and playwrights and artists and intellectuals, even if they try to be apolitical in their work, are always viewed with dread and suspicion by fascist regimes, and today is no exception. You need only look at what goes on in Russia, Turkey, Hungary, Brazil, or, say, the Philippines. Okay, let's move on now to the play itself. Act 1 opens with a conversation between the bridegroom and his mother that introduces three of the play's most important and evolving symbols as the son is preparing to go out to work in the vineyard that they own. The mother is anxious about this, as she seems to be anxious about everything that he does. She asks him where he's going. To the vineyard. Wait, do you want something? Son, your food. Leave it. I'll eat grapes. Give me the knife. What for? To cut them. muttering and looking for it. The knife, the knife. Damn all of them and the scoundrel who invented knives. Let's change the subject. And shotguns and pistols, even the tiniest knife. And mattocks and pitchforks. All right, Mom. Everything that can cut a man's body. A beautiful man tasting the fullness of life. He goes out to the vineyards or tends to his olives because they are his inherited. A little bit later in the conversation, she says that I don't know how you can carry a knife on your body, nor how can leave the serpent inside the chest. Is that it? If I lived to be 100, I wouldn't speak of anything else. First, your father. He had the scent of a carnation for me, and I enjoyed him for 3 short years. And then your brother. Is it fair? Is it possible that a thing as small as a pistol or a knife could put an end to a man who was a bull? Now, note that even after this, she goes on to describe the potency of the men in that particular bloodline. You come from good stock, good blood. Your grandfather left a son on every street corner. That's what I like. Men to be men. Wheat, wheat. Now, almost all of Lorca's symbols, which we find emerging here, point in opposite directions as the play develops and as their meanings multiply. None of these symbols that I've mentioned are stable or one-dimensional, but we see oppositional meanings in the knife emerging from the very start. On the one hand, the bridegroom associates the knife that he is about to carry to the vineyard with phallic life, with reproductive energy. He takes it to the vineyard where he wants to use it to cut grapes in order to feed himself in that rich, fertile soil. On the other hand, the mother regards the knife as the source of violent death that has deprived her of her husband and her other son. Later, she explains this to the bride's father, this horror of knives and what they can do, when she says that 22, that's what my son would have been if he were still alive. He'd be alive and warm and true, a true man that he was, if men hadn't invented knives. Now, like Mora, the mother in Riders to the Sea, the mother in Lorca's play lives in a perpetual state of mourning the dead men she has lost, and in a state of dread that her remaining son, the bridegroom, will join them because he is a man, in much the same way Amora fears that Bartley will die as her only son. Thus, she says to her son, I'd like you to be a woman so that we could embroider together, so that you'd be here in the house with me, so that you wouldn't be going out to the stream. In short, I'd like you to be a woman because the fact you are a man seems immediately to doom you to a violent death. Now, the bridegroom wants to try to revive his despondent and fearful mother by taking her out to the vineyard, this place of vitality, this rich soil. But she feels too old, she says, to return to any sense of passionate life at all. All she has are the memories of when her husband used to take her out to that vineyard, which was clearly for them a place of sexual lovemaking, a place of creative energy, of reproductive life. Lorca introduces another rich symbol in this conversation when the mother reminds her son that he comes from what she calls good blood. Blood, a symbol announced in the play's very title, points, I would suggest, in at least 4 directions that we're going to see. First, blood refers to the family bloodline in which the bridegroom is a part and its reproductive potential. Potent men, fertile soil. The mother brags that, quote, your grandfather left a son on every street corner, not necessarily by the same woman, and that her husband was just as potent, as she tells the bride's father with great pride, this particular powerful male bloodline. She said, my son will cover your daughter well. He's of good seed. His father could have had many more sons with me. Thus the notion of blood as rooted in the family bloodline of reproductive strength. Now, the mother's husband was able to sire only 2 sons by her, however, because he was killed in an ancestral blood feud with the Felix family, which introduces a second meaning of blood. Like sexual vitality, which is hereditary, this blood feud is also inherited, as if transmitted in the blood from generation to generation, as if it's inescapable, as if the blood feud is something beyond the control of any individual. The mother explains this sense of destiny also to the bride's father when they visit, when she says that the blood of his entire family, the Felixes, it comes from his great-grandfather who started the killing, and it spreads through the whole breed of all of them knife handlers, all of them smiling hypocrites. On the face of every one of them, I can only see the hand that killed what was mine. Okay? Now, just as the blood feud is hereditary and transmitted from generation to generation, so too the blame assigned to those killings passes from generation to generation, and the mother has clearly inherited that. When she's talking to her neighbor earlier, Leonardo's name comes up. He was once, the mother learned, involved with the bride, but the mother despises him even before that, because after all, Leonardo is a member of the Felix family. Thus, she holds him guilty for killings that occurred even when he was a little boy. What, Leonardo? Leonardo, one of the Felix family, the neighbor says. Getting up the Felix family? Woman, how can Leonardo be blamed for anything? He was 8 years old when those things happened. To which the mother replies, I know, but I hear that name, Felix, and for me, Felix is the same as filling my mouth with slime. She spits, and I have to spit. I have to spit so it doesn't poison me. Okay. Now, this hatred is transmitted from generation to generation clearly as well. Closely related to blood, in the sense of the inherited blood feud, is a third symbolic association with blood. The bloodshed that feud has literally caused. Blood that the mother fetishizes and that will be shed again at the climax of the play because of the forbidden passion of Leonardo and the bride. And here, Lorca introduces a fourth symbolic association with blood. Blood as the element of sexual passion, in this case, lawless passion. Lorca establishes this meaning in the mother-in-law's strange chant later in Act 1, when she speaks of Leonardo as a restless horse seeking the bride. Quote, his blood ran strong and fast, faster than the water could. Yes, it is the passion in Leonardo's blood for a woman, not his wife, that drives him. Now, the third major symbol that Lorca introduces in the opening conversation that I have quoted from between the bridegroom and his mother is flowers. She describes her dead son and her husband as, quote, smelling like carnations when they were alive. But as we'll see, different meanings gather around different types of flowers in this play, including orange blossoms and roses. Well, just as the mother dreads losing her son to violent death as she's lost her husband and other son, the mother also fears losing her son to marriage. She tells the bridegroom that when he marries, quote, I'll be left alone. I've got only you. But she refuses to come and live with him at his invitation, to live with him and the bride, because, like Electra, the mother says she needs to tend her husband and her son's graves as her one activity, that she needs to be there not just to honor them, but also to protect them lest one of the Felixes try to bury one of their kin next to them or nearby. But it's not just the prospect of being left alone that troubles the mother about her son's marriage plans. Her sense of destiny, rooted in blood inheritance, extends also to her knowledge of the bride's family, specifically to the bride's mother, who ran away from her husband. Indeed, the mother calls that woman, quote, a plant. It calls the bride later a plant from a wicked mother. The mother fears that the bride is going to do the same thing that her mother did, that the bride will abandon her son. And of course she's right, because characters in this play repeat the same patterns as their ancestors as if they were living out immutable destinies, even though they may try to resist them. The mother's fear of this abandonment, a kind of hereditary gesture on the bride's part, emerges when she chats with the neighbor. And they're talking about the bride's mother. Didn't she love her husband? The neighbor asks. No, she was proud. Oh, it's always the same, the mother says. I wish no one knew either of them, the girl or her mother. They were like two thistles that no one dares name, and if you do, they prick you. Yes, in the language of flowers, they're not flowers at all. There's something like weeds that she associates with both the mother of her prospective daughter-in-law and the daughter-in-law herself. Now, this idea that the mother has of a kind of heredity of sexual inappropriateness might remind you of Racine. You'll recall there we heard about the sexual indiscretions of Phaedra's mother that cast suspicion over Phaedra herself and that seemed to predict Phaedra's own illicit and ungovernable desires. And the same is true with the bride. Well, both of the mother's fears come true. Her fear that her son will be killed by the Felixes is realized, just as her husband had been, and her fear that the bride will be unfaithful and act on her transgressive desires as the bride's mother did is also fulfilled. Now, this latter prospect seems even more ominous. The possibility that the bride might act like her mother seems even more ominous when the mother learns from her neighbor that the bride had a romantic relationship with Leonardo when the bride was just 15, and that relationship lasted 3 years, the same length of time as the mother's marriage. Now the bride is 22, and Leonardo is married to the bride's cousin, who is identified simply as the wife of Leonardo. Now, 3 factors then trouble the mother about the bride even before the mother ever meets her. First, her mother's inconstancy. Second, the rumor of her relationship with another man. And third, the fact that other man was a Felix. She spits when she says that name, Felix, but then a moment later we're told she crosses herself. The hatred that impels her spitting will prove, however, far more powerful than any form of religious self-control. Here, as in Riders to the Sea, Catholic practices operate in conjunction with folk superstitions and ideas of destiny, but the Catholic practices and prayers here too seem largely ineffectual in the face of blood feuds, folk traditions, and family destinies. Even as the mother clings to her son and doubts the worthiness of his bride-to-be, she is herself filled with frustrated sexual yearning, the yearning that a widow in her culture will always experience and can never satisfy because they are consigned culturally to a life thereafter of celibacy. And now she recalls, both for the bride's father and for her friend and her son, how her husband used to treat her with such passionate love. She tells her son how he used to lift her as he is lifting her and carry her, how he used to take her to the fertile vineyard, the place of lovemaking. But in this culture, a widow doesn't remarry. Her life in the senses is over. The mother is paralyzed not just by that tradition, but by her sorrow. She's cloistered from the world, nourishing memories of a past that she can never relive. She says to her neighbor, "It's 20 years since I went even to the top of the street." The mother is afraid of the world outside, where, the neighbor tells her, a local boy who left the village had, quote, both arms cut off by a machine, an image that resonates and looks forward to violent moments in the film to come. But the little world that the mother inhabits will prove to be no less violent than that world in which the neighbor's friend was arms cut off in what is clearly also a suggestion of a kind of figurative castration. Now, The mother's situation, I hope, recalled to you that of Electra in her paralysis and in her protracted mourning. And also, like Electra, whose relationship with her father Agamemnon was perhaps a bit too close, the mother's love for her son at times seems perhaps to be overweening and even to border on the unnatural. Shades perhaps also of the overly close relationship between Hamlet and Gertrude. Perhaps what she feels for her son or expresses is a displacement of her own blunted, frustrated love for her dead husband. But certainly there is a curious moment when, as he is ready to go out to the vineyard, she says, I will. And she goes to kiss him. Go on then, she says. You're far too big for kisses now. Give them to your wife. Pause a moment and decide when she is your wife. And of course, she doesn't want that moment to come anytime too soon. Give your kisses, not to me, but to your wife. This suggests a rather grudging concession to her son's upcoming marriage and a strong physical bond with him. Scene 2 in Act 1 shifts to Leonardo's house, where his wife and mother are chanting in verse a lullaby, as the play now shifts from prose to poetry. This lullaby, which is chanted ostensibly to put the baby to sleep, is really a lament that they both understand, because these women know that Leonardo no longer loves his wife, if he ever did, and that the two are no longer having sex. This is all rendered in a language of symbols as they begin at Leonardo's house. Oh, the great big stallion wouldn't drink the deep water, the mother-in-law chants, where the water's so black, where the trees grow thick and strong. Who can say, my little one, what water's anguish is as he draws his tail along through that nice green room of his? And then the mother-in-law goes on, go to sleep, little one, the child, my little rose, for the horse now starts to weep. Horsey's hooves are red with blood, Horsey's mane is frozen, deep inside his staring eyes a silver dagger's broken. To which the wife then responds, Horsey will not touch the bank, even though the bank is wet, even though his mouth is hot, streaming tiny drops of sweat. Now, within this poetic chant, Leonardo is clearly the stallion, like the one that he literally rides so hard. This stallion, Leonardo, won't drink from the water in the river that is near the bank, even though it is deep. That is, he won't have sex with his wife, and she is in anguish at his withdrawal because, as she says, the bank is wet. She still desires him. She wants him. But the women both sense that Leonardo is in pain himself. Thus, as the mother-in-law chants, the horse starts to weep. Its hooves are bleeding. There seems to be pain here, the pain of frustration, it would appear, because Leonardo desires another woman who is far off and unattainable, that is, the bride. The mother-in-law offers a prophecy that Leonardo will inevitably seek that woman, and that the woman will be receptive. She regards this as inevitable. The wife says, oh, the great big stallion wouldn't drink the deep water. And the mother-in-law replies, don't come near, don't come in. Seek the far-off mountain, find the dark, the gray valley. There the mare will be waiting. That mare, the mother-in-law knows, will be the bride. Now, the bride is in that distant gray valley because literally her father's land is both far away and barren, gray. There's also a prophetic suggestion, however, in the in the description of Leonardo, the stallion's pain. The mother-in-law says that like a silver dagger broken inside his staring eyes, she sees that pain somehow within him, using that image of the knife. Now, an actual dagger will later enter Leonardo's body, foreshadowed here by the image of the broken dagger that she seems to imagine behind his eyes. And the metaphoric blood on the horse's hooves will, of course, be actualized as real blood by the end of the play. Thus, the sense of the prophetic in this chant. Well, news of the bride's upcoming marriage only intensifies Leonardo's pent-up desire for her. Just as in Phaedra, barriers heighten desire because it is forbidden. The more barriers, the more forbidden it becomes, the stronger the desire, until it becomes an uncontrollable inner force that operates along with the force of family history. Leonardo is frustrated, jealous at the bride's imminent wedding, and he vents his anger at his wife when he comes into the house. The wife says, tomorrow, the wedding will be in less than a month. I expect they'll invite us. Leonardo seriously then says, who knows? The mother-in-law replies with malice. When he says that, who knows? That's because he knows her. Don't you know that she was his girl for 3 years? Leonardo then says, but I left her. Turning to his wife, are you going to cry now? Stop it. He roughly pulls her hands from her face. Let's go and see the child. And when they do, again, he vents his frustration and anger at his wife. The wife says, what's the matter with you? What's boiling away inside your head? Don't leave me like that, not knowing anything. Stop it, he says. Now, at this point, Leonardo's desire is blocked and intensified by 4 different barriers, intensified because it's blocked. First, he is himself married to a woman who has borne him a child. Second, his desire is blocked by the bride's upcoming wedding. Third, his desire is blocked because the man that the bride is marrying is an enemy of his own family. And fourth, his desire is blocked because of his poverty, which is the primary reason why he was unable to marry the bride himself years earlier. By contrast, the bridegroom, as we saw in the opening scene, is the prosperous owner of a vineyard, of a fertile farm. Scene 3 shifts to a third location, the bride's house, which is symbolically significant in itself. Consider the stage directions. Interior of the cave where the bride lives. At the back, a cross of big pink flowers. The doors are round with lace curtains and pink ribbon, but on the walls, made of white hard material, are round fans, blue jars, and small mirrors. This whitewashed subterranean cave is surrounded, we learn, by arid land. Things won't grow there. The setting suggests that the bride's state of frustrated sexual denial, the sense of an absence of vitality, is clear in the setting. And the setting also suggests the bride's feeling of entrapment, of confinement in her father's house. The small mirrors on the interior of this rounded white cave seem to direct everything inward rather than outward at a time when she wants desperately to escape, to be out of the house. But unfortunately, the bride doesn't see any real liberation from her domestic prison, where she lives just with her father, in her upcoming marriage. No, she fears that that will be just another version. Now, in setting the scene in this cave, I would suggest that Lorca may well be drawing on the myth of Persephone, who lives underground herself, but who longs to return to life, and in the spring does so in the form of flowers. But this isn't possible, this renewal for the bride, if she marries the bridegroom, because he is a man that she doesn't love, for whom she feels no vital, invigorating passion. Well, just as Lorca employs evolving symbols in the play, he also uses colors expressionistically throughout to evoke different moods and states of characters' feelings. The dominant colors are red and black and white. But as with the symbols that I've already begun to discuss, each of these colors holds manifold meanings depending on the context. Red is associated at times both with passion and with violent death. Black is associated at times with death, but also with passion, in that Leonardo and the bride ride off together in the black of night. White is associated with purity, but also with sterility, as in the white shiny interior of this sterile cave, and also later with death, both in the moon, who is an embodiment of death, and in the white sheets that cover the bloodless corpses. Lorca also introduces, I hope you noticed in this play, symbolic musical sounds that he plays off against one another. Guitars dominate the scenes where tradition holds sway, where there's a sense of a binding restriction rooted in cultural or religious traditions in the first two acts, while violins play in Act 3 in the forest, that place of passionate release to which the bride and Leonardo escape, or try to escape. Now, in contrast to that forest, the land where the bride lives is, as noted, a wasteland that reflects the absence of any sexual satisfaction in her life. During the visit, Lorca evokes the ancient idea that the state of land reflects the sexual bond between a man and a wife. Both the mother and the bride's father understand and embrace this concept. The bridegroom says to the mother, "These are dry lands." She says, "Your father would have covered them with trees," she tells the bridegroom. "Without water, he'd have looked for it. 3 years of marriage, he would have planted 10 cherry trees here. No, he and I would have been together here, and our passionate love, our reproductive love for one another, would have been reflected in his planting things on this land." The father says, "If we could use 20 teams of oxen to bring your vineyards here and put them on the hillside, oh, what a joy that would be." The mother says, "But why?" And the father says, "Mine is hers and hers his. That's why to see it all together would be a thing of beauty." He would like to resuscitate his own barren land by bringing the land of the bridegroom there, just as the bride, his daughter, and the groom, her son, are united. The idea that somehow the land can be resuscitated, revived, reinvigorated through their reproductive union. Now, the bride's father then looks to the groom to revive his land by impregnating his daughter, as the mother certainly assures him he's capable of doing. But the meeting is troubling because it seems clear that the young couple are not well matched. They have different temperaments and differing degrees of experience in love. The bridegroom, his mother says, quote, "has never known a woman. In fact," she says, "his name is cleaner than a sheet spread in the sun," this virginal man. The bride, on the other hand, had a passionate but unconsummated love with Leonardo, but apparently everything but consummated. The groom is a man of steady habits, while the bride is given to powerful, even violent emotions, suggested when the father says she can cut a piece of string with her teeth. It's an interesting way to compliment your daughter. Now, even if the bride wasn't already in love with Leonardo, she is not the kind of woman who would be happy in the domestic life that the mother-in-law says awaits her and that the groom wants her to live. The mother, in speaking to the bride, offers her this warning. The father says that my daughter is like my wife in every way. That troubles the mother. Is she? She says. Such a lovely expression. You know what getting married is, don't you, child? She says, turning to the bride. Solemnly, the bride says, I do. The mother says, marriage is a man, children, and as for the rest, a wall that's 2 feet thick. To which the bridegroom then adds, who needs anything else? The bride's solemn I do anticipates the wedding vow that will follow not long after. But clearly the bride looks both to marriage and domestic life with a sense of dread, or at best resignation, that recalls Hedda Gabler's. And like Hedda, the bride is passionately attracted to another man with whom she had had an intense bond in the past. By contrast, the bridegroom is utterly devoted to her. He says, when I leave your side, I feel a great emptiness. and a kind of lump in my throat. Well, he loves her, but his love is more sentimental than erotic, and it's rather needy. It's not the kind of overpowering, magnetic, fiery desire that the bride and Leonardo feel for one another. Well, the bride tries to convince herself that she can find satisfaction with the bridegroom. She's been trying for some time, that she can fill his emptiness and resist her own transgressive impulses in marriage to him. But of course, she's fooling herself, and she knows it. Her anger erupts at the servant almost immediately after the groom leaves because she knows how mismatched they are. When the servant says, "It's as if you had no wish to get married," the bride bites her hand in anger. "Oh! Child, what's the matter?" the servant says. And then the bride says, gripping her by the wrists, the servant says, "Let's see the presents." The bride then, gripping her by the wrist, says, "Let's go." "Woman, let's go," I said. "You're stronger than a man," says the servant. "Ah," says the bride, "haven't I done a man's work? I wish I were one. I wish I were a man." Now, like Leonardo, the bride channels her sexual frustration, her blunted desire, into aggression. And like Hedda Gabler, the bride, in doing so, envies male freedom and conceives of men as somehow being free from the hated prison of domesticity. But in fact, neither the bride nor Leonardo really is free because they're both unable to control their desire for one another. It's true that Leonardo rides back and forth across the countryside on his horse, and that the bride somehow envies that and sees that as a sign of power and freedom, but it isn't really, because he's driven like a moth to a flame by his longing for her. In fact, the efforts of the bride and Leonardo to resist one another, to impose limits, constrictions on their passion, have only inflamed that longing in a way very much like Racine's notion of desire that mounts with its very impossibility of fulfillment. Leonardo rides his horse to the point of exhaustion each night to the bride's house without saying a word to her, but she can see him and hear him at the window. That window is a physical barrier that separates the two of them, and that seems in some ways to reflect all of the other barriers that, rather than in any way establishing roles apart, only inflames their need for each other. Well, the bride feels destined to repeat the life of her mother in an unhappy marriage because she knows how profoundly restless she is and how she will be unable, despite her own wishes, to live with the bridegroom. The bride says to the servant at the beginning of Act 2, "My mother came from a place where there were lots of trees. She came from a fertile land." The servant says, "That's why she was so full of joy." "Ah," the bride says, "but she wasted away here her fate." The bride says, "Like we're all wasting away." Yes. The bride understands that if she stays in a domestic arrangement, in a marriage with a man she does not love, she will be reenacting her mother's misery. But then she reenacts another aspect of her mother, of course, when she runs away with Leonardo, because in doing so, in trying to escape her mother's wasted life, she reenacts her mother's own flight from that life, her mother's own act of abandoning her husband. Act 2 opens on the day of the bride's wedding. It's a Thursday, 4 days after Act 1 had ended. We begin in pre-dawn darkness, and the act closes at nightfall. In between these two darknesses, the bride is arrayed for her marriage ceremony and then absconds at the reception with Leonardo. When the servant, at the beginning of Act 2, tries to put an orange blossom wreath on the bride, she resists. Now, in cultural tradition, orange blossoms are associated with sexual purity of the bride as she enters marriage. But the bride subverts that symbolic cultural association, we're told, by throwing the wreath away. The bridegroom is later disappointed that she didn't wear it on her dress. While she may be technically a virgin, as she later insists, the bride's passionate relationship with Leonardo makes the idea of a symbol of her traditional purity a lie that she will not countenance. Indeed, part of the play's tragedy, though, is that even when the bride and Leonardo surrender to their desire and flee into the forest, they don't have time to consummate that sexual passion. Thus, the bride is doomed to die a virgin. Orange blossoms have other implications as well. Consider Leonardo's comment on the bride's orange blossoms when he sees them arriving quite inappropriately early on the morning of her wedding. Did the bridegroom bring the orange blossom so she can wear it on her heart? He asks her sarcastically, to which she says, "Why do you want to know if they brought the orange blossoms? What are you hinting at?" To which Leonardo says, "What would I be hinting at? You know me, I'm not hinting. Tell me, what was I to you? Open your memory, refresh it. But 2 oxen and a broken down shack are almost nothing. That's the thorn." Now, note that these flowers, Leonardo indicates, are expensive. Was it the bridegroom and his family who brought them? Yes, they were. Leonardo, knowing that, accuses the bride of marrying for money, essentially. He says he's not hinting, and it's fairly clear. It was, in fact, the lack of money that prevented him from marrying her years before, because all he had to offer to this already poor woman was a broken down shack and 2 oxen, and he doesn't seem to have very much more now. So there's a sense then of resentment at a class distinction, at an economic distinction, and that is yet another barrier that fuels desire and increases his jealousy. Now, in addition to orange blossoms, roses are another flower traditionally associated and used in marriages. In this case, roses are meant to symbolize spousal love, and indeed, the bride wears a pattern of roses on her silk stockings. But Lorca transforms the traditional meaning of this flower symbol in marriage when the bride confesses before she is wed to Leonardo of the erotic power that he still has over her and that she's been trying to resist through marrying, using the image of roses. Talking about it, she says that when I'm with you, when I hear you, it's as if I drunk a bottle of anise and fallen asleep on a bedspread of roses, and it drags me along, and I know that I'm drowning, but I still go on. Now, like the rose symbol itself, which is bifurcated here, linked on the one hand with spousal love and on the other with transgressive, delirious longing, the bride is herself torn between the demands of tradition and the force of her passionate need. The scene with Leonardo reveals that the fire of passion is indeed still burning in both of them, and he reminds her of that, almost taunting her while also pleading with her. The bride admits that when Leonardo rides by her window at night, she is powerfully tempted to ride off with him, away from her lonely life in this wasteland, even though she knows he is married to her cousin, even though it would be forbidden. She says, "A man with a horse knows many things and can do a lot to take advantage of a girl abandoned in a desert. But I've got my pride, which is why I'm getting married, and I'll shut myself away with my husband, and I'll love him above everything." Well, note that just as Leonardo married the bride's cousin in an attempt to rein in his desire for the bride when he could not marry her, so too the bride now tells Leonardo that she's marrying another man, quote, to shut herself away from him, despite the fact that she feels such a potent longing and fascination for this man whom she loved before in her abandoned desert state when he rides by on his horse. Well, as the bride's future mother-in-law told her, marriage means living behind, quote, a wall 2 feet thick, and part of her feels she needs that in order to rein in her passion. The bride fears, however, that 2-foot thick wall, but she fears her transgressive desires at this point even more. Thus, she's torn between these competing fears. So just before the ceremony, the bride then tells the bridegroom in isolation what she would like to believe he will provide for her, an escape from the agony of her own passion, a reining in, even though it may be dreary. It's what she feels she needs. She says, I want to be your wife and to be alone with you and not hear any voice but yours. You remember she talks about the way in which Leonardo's voice in itself can make her tremble with passion. I only want to hear your voice, just yours, she says to her husband-to-be, to which he says, that's what I want. And then the bride adds, and to see only your eyes, and to have you hold me so tight that even if my mother were to call me, my dead mother, I couldn't free myself from you. Even if my mother, who left my father, even if my adulterous mother called me to reenact what she did, I'd still be held back. Well, she's afraid both of the dreariness of her mother's life wearying and withering, and afraid of her mother's reaction to it, afraid of either of them, but at this point more afraid of the transgression. Now, the groom thinks that the bride here means that she loves him only and that she wants to devote her life to him. But what, of course, she really means is that she wants with him protection against her adulterous desire for Leonardo and against what she fears may be her destiny to reenact her mother's infidelity. She is then, the bride, afraid of herself, or more precisely, afraid most of all, at this point, of her ability to control both her desire and her heredity. Well, consider Leonardo's response to the bride when she says that she's marrying, as we've just seen, so as to wall herself off from him. He feels that this will simply be impossible because he's tried it himself. He says, to keep quiet and burn is the greatest punishment we can heap on ourselves. What use was pride to me and not seeing you and leaving you awake night after night? No use. It only brought the fire down on top of me more. When the roots of things go deep, no one can pull them up. The fact that we didn't talk when I would ride by at night only inflamed desire. The fact that we were separated, the fact that I'm married, the fact that you're about to be married, our roots of desire are so deep, no one can pull them up. And thus he speaks of the quiet burning and burning and burning inside that they've both felt for over 3 years. Now, his words reveal what Racine depicts in Phaedra, that desire burns hotter and longer when it is deferred, hotter and longer when it remains unfulfilled until it has to be acted on. Well, listening to Leonardo, the bride is sexually aroused there and then on the morning of her wedding. She's mesmerized so much by the sound of her voice. Struggling to describe how she feels, she compares her passion to drunkenness, to drinking a bottle of anisette, or to being dragged by the wave of the sea. Note that Lorca presents desire both in the language of raging fire, which Leonardo uses, and flood or waves, which the bride invokes. Both of these are natural forces that override man-made boundaries, the restrictions of conscience, social conventions, religious law, and religious and civil institutions like marriage itself. The natural force of that desire obliterates all of them, despite all of those internal and external attempts to check it. Now, the church, which will soon join the bride and groom, regards marriage as a sacrament and blesses it as a state of monogamy in which sex is meant to function as a form of reproduction. But the ungovernable desire that the bride and Leonardo feel for one another have nothing to do with a desire to reproduce or with the renewal of the land or anything like it. It is simple, white-hot, incandescent, carnal passion. It's notable that when the bride is arrayed for the marriage ceremony, she is dressed not in white as we would expect, but rather in black. And she is dressed not in the style of the 1930s, but rather, we're told, in the style of 1900, when her mother was married so unhappily. It's as if marriage is for her in some way a reenactment of her mother's greatest unhappiness and a kind of funeral of her own life or her own soul. It's as if she is already aware that she's following the footstep of a mother who, she said, wasted away in a miserable marriage and then tried to break away in a scandalous affair. It's as if in the very ceremony itself, she's calling attention to her failure to live up to everything that ceremony would seem to impose upon her. Like the bride, Leonardo's wife similarly sees herself as destined to follow a particular trajectory of her own family history. We learn that the woman's father abandoned her mother, that is, abandoned the mother-in-law that we saw in the second scene. And that this may be why that mother-in-law understands so clearly that Leonardo is destined to do the same. In short, she understands that her own daughter is destined to be abandoned the same way she was abandoned. She says, it's the way things are. Leonardo's wife says, it's the way things are. My mother's fate was the same as my fate. She knows, and her mother knows, that Leonardo will abandon her. Now remember then that this helps to explain why her mother could foresee the same thing happening to her when the two of them were chanting. It was based on the mother's own experience. Okay, now note that at this point, as I've noted, the bride is afraid both of a restricted, isolated life with a man she doesn't love, and afraid of her lawless passion for Leonardo. And this terror comes out clearly when the groom we realize in passages like the one I've just quoted, that what Aristotle calls tragic necessity is in bloodletting both the monumental power of erotic desire and the power of blood inheritance that generates the same events within the same families to recur. The doomed struggle between carnal desire and family history, doomed to failure, is really the essence of Lorca's tragedies, the attempt to resist those forces. And in this respect, it takes us back to Greek tragedy, where characters such as Orestes inherit a blood feud that they feel they are destined to perpetuate, even at the cost of their own destruction. Now, the blood feud between the groom's family and the Felixes is the clearest manifestation of that irresistible force of heredity, where sons and daughters must repeat the sins of their parents. The groom naively imagines that he can escape that feud that killed his father and brother, and he tells his mother not to worry, but of course she knows better. She's filled with dread, but she's also filled, this mother, with a violent rage herself that she struggles to subdue. She says to the bride's father, in talking about this, that there is a scream here in my heart that's always rising up, and I have to force it down again and again, hide it in these shawls. They've taken my dead ones from me, and I have to be silent. Part of her would like to strike out at them. She says that when her son died, when I reached my son, he was lying in the middle of the road. I wet my hands with his blood, and I licked them with my tongue, because it was mine. You don't know what that means. Well, licking the blood of her slain son, the mother seems to take on and commit herself to the very blood feud that she also tries to resist because she fears that it will claim her remaining son. Now, just as the mother says that the father couldn't understand that, So too, the bride and Leonardo come from bloodlines marked by restlessness and transgressive passion that neither the groom nor Leonardo's wife can understand. Those in this play who are driven by passion, which includes the mother, know that others simply cannot fathom what they go through. When Leonardo tells his wife that he's going to ride on his horse to the church rather than go with her in the carriage, he says, "I'm not the kind of man to go by a cart." He can't adopt himself to the role of husband and father, and he resents his wife as an impediment to his sexual freedom. Yet Leonardo's passion for the bride, as I've noted, is a compulsion itself. It is not a mark of genuine freedom precisely because he cannot control it. Indeed, to put it bluntly, there is no real free will in this play. Well, we don't witness the wedding on stage, but we do see the reception, in which Lorca juxtaposes the force of ritualized religious and cultural traditions against the force of sexual passion and family inheritance. The dance we see on stage, which is done to traditional guitar music, is an expression of cultural tradition. It's ritualized, ordered, controlled, and communal. In short, it's the antithesis of the passion burning in the newly married bride and Leonardo, which is anarchic, explosive, transgressive, and secret. We see that the bride, immediately after being married, is already chafing under everything that wedlock and the customs surrounding it imply. And the mother, who seems already suspicious of her before she's married, notices this. The mother says, "Your blessings weigh heavily." Guitars are heard. The bride says, "Like lead." The mother then strongly says, "But they shouldn't. You should be as light as a dove." The groom, too, senses that something is wrong because the bride won't join him when he asks her to dance, when he asks her, in short, to be part of this communal, traditional ritual. He says, "Let's go dance for a bit," and he kisses her. Disturbed, the bride says, "No, I want to go lie down on the bed." The bridegroom says, "I'll come with you." She says, No, not with all these people here. What would they say? Let me rest for a moment." "Whatever you want," he says, "but don't be like that tonight." To which she replies, standing at the door, "I'll be better tonight." "I hope you will," he says. Now, as first the bride asks her new husband not to go, remember, because she was afraid of what she might do, afraid of her lawless passion where it would take her. She feels so overpowered by her adulterous desire that she says, before the passage I just read, to the servant, "I feel as if someone has struck me on the head." But then she says to the bridegroom that she wants to be alone, ostensibly to rest, but really it is to run off at this moment with Leonardo. Her remark to the bridegroom, "I'll be better tonight," is coded. The groom is meant to think that she means, "I'll be better tonight because I'll be ready to enjoy our wedding night. I will not dance with you now, but I'll be with you then." But in this moment of double discourse, the bride is really speaking to herself, and she means, "I'll be better tonight because tonight I'll be with Leonardo." This moment, one might say, is the point of Aristotelian hamartia. It is a mistake that will lead to the tragic calamity. But it is not what one could call an error in judgment, because the bride really isn't capable of freely thinking or freely acting here. She's driven by compulsion. The power of her desire dictates her flight with Leonardo, no matter how she may struggle against it, as we've already seen. When we next see the bride in Act 3, she and Leonardo are on the run in the moonlight. Well, how do we know that she intends to run away with Leonardo at this exact moment, or that this is in some way the pivotal instant? Well, consider an important but subtle exchange that occurs just a few minutes prior to this. The bridegroom says to the bride, "Did you like the orange blossom?" The bride, looking at him fixedly, "Yes." "Ah, it's all made of wax. It'll last forever. I'd like you to have worn them all over your dress." The bride says, "No, there was no need for that." Leonardo goes off to the right, and then The girl says, "We'll take the pins out of dress." The bride then says, "I'll be back in a moment." Okay, a moment later, the wife says, "Where's Leonardo?" And the servant says, "I haven't seen him." The bridegroom says, "He must be with the guests." His wife says, "I'll go see him." Ah, but he isn't there. Note that they leave stage at the same time. The important thing that is happening here is really happening off stage, where both Leonardo and the bride have gone almost simultaneously. Seeing him leave, Leonardo goes off. The bride then excuses herself. Immediately thereafter, when, as I've noted, she says, "I'll be back in a minute." It's as if she and Leonardo understand one another without having to communicate with words. Now, note that the important things that are happening then off stage are things that we do not see until Act 3. But it seems fairly clear that in this brief absence together, the two of them plan their getaway later in the scene. Well, the wife is already suspicious. She says, "Where's Leonardo?" Meanwhile, the groom is, in the passage I read, smothering his new bride. He says he would like to cover her with the waxed orange blossoms that he bought as a mark of his love, and suggest a kind of desire for constant possession of her. He wants to make her part of his property. He wishes in some way that she had worn them all over, more than what little she has worn. Now, even though Leonardo seems to have asked the bride to run away with him during the brief offstage meeting that I just referred to, when she returns, she is still conflicted enough because she is afraid both of a restrictive, isolated life with a man she doesn't love, and still afraid of the lawless passion for Leonardo that she seems already to have committed herself to. And this double terror comes out when the groom embraces the bride unexpectedly, and she instinctively thinks that the man behind her who's embracing her might be Leonardo. It's a fascinating moment. The bridegroom enters slowly and embraces the bride from behind. The bride, startled, "Don't! Are you frightened of me?" he said. Oh, it's you. Well, who else? Me or your father? Yes, the bride says, "though your father would have hugged you more gently." Yes, the bride says gloomily. Yes, because he's old. And now he embraces her strongly and a bit roughly. "Stop it," she says. "Why?" he says, releasing her. "Well, the guests, they can see us." "Yes, but we've taken our vows." But then the bride says, "Yes, but leave me now, please." Okay. Now, at this moment, the bride is afraid of any embrace, afraid of the binding embrace either of her father or of her new husband. But she's also afraid of Leonardo's embrace precisely because she longs for it so much and has committed herself to acting on it. Now, the barrier of marriage, with all of its social and religious emphasis on monogamy, has clearly, in this day, only intensified both her desire and Leonardo's, but it has also intensified her dread of it and of the consequences, even though it's clear that she knows she's going to act on it. As Act 2 ends, the mother, who feared the blood feud which took her son and her husband, now seeing that the bride and Leonardo are gone together, urges her son, the bridegroom, to renew that feud, to take vengeance against Leonardo, both as the man who stole his wife and as a member of the hated Felix clan. Thus, at the end of Act 2, she says, "Let's go and help my son. Help now." People split into groups. He's got plenty of family, his cousins from the coast and all those from inland. Go out from here. Search all the roads. The hour of blood has come again. Two sides. You on yours, me on mine. After them. Get after them. Now, the mother's words, "the hour of blood has come again," unites the folk tragedy of a local war between two families in southern Spain with the universalizing conventions of Greek tragedy and myth, in which events are destined to repeat themselves over and over and over. And that phrase, "the hour of blood has come again," also points to the mythological framework of the play, suggesting that all human history is really a repetition of the same basic stories and the same elemental patterns.